I've been hiking solo for about 6 years now. I'm comfortable enough in the wilderness that I don't need to stick to main trails anymore, which is probably what got me into this situation in the first place. This happened last October in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. I'd driven up from Virginia for a long weekend, planning to hit some of the more remote sections that didn't see much traffic. The weather was perfect, mid-50s if I had to guess. Overcast, but not rainy. I was looking forward to some real solitude. I was maybe 4 hours into the hike when I reached what I can only describe as a gorge. It wasn't some massive canyon or anything, but it was deep enough, probably 30 or 40 feet down to a rocky bottom with a small creek running through it. Not a guaranteed death if you fell, but you'd definitely break something, and the walls looked impossible to climb with all that loose shale and overhang. There was this massive fallen oak wedged between both sides at a slight angle. It was pretty thick. The bark was worn smooth from weather and probably other hikers using it as a bridge. I inspected it for a few minutes to make sure it was sturdy, then decided it looked solid enough for me. I took my time getting across, trying to maintain focus. I safely reached the other side, and by the time I was back on solid ground, I realized I'd gotten a really nice adrenaline rush from the balancing act. But then I heard this rhythmic thunking sound behind me. I turned around, and there was a guy on the other side of the gorge, maybe 10 feet from where the tree met the bank. He was older, definitely in his 50s, wearing this ratty camo jacket and old-looking jeans. He also had a scraggly beard that made him kind of look like your stereotypical lumberjack. It took me a second to realize what he was holding. It was an axe, a full-size axe. Maybe he really was a lumberjack, but I couldn't think. I was still in shock at the sight of it. He walked right over to the base of the tree and started swinging his axe at it. I shouted across at him, asking what the hell he was doing. He didn't even look up, he just kept swinging. To my horror, I watched as one of his swings landed a little deeper than the others. The tree shifted slightly. I yelled louder, telling him to stop, and that I'd just crossed the gorge on that thing. It dawned on me that this guy probably already knew that, and he was trying to strand me on the other side. He didn't show any signs of stopping, so I yelled increasingly insulting things at him, stuff that didn't even make sense. I finally yelled that I'd need to cross back to the other side, and that's when he finally looked up at me and said, "That's not my problem." He said it so casually, like I'd asked him about the weather. I don't know why, but his casual tone infuriated me, and I admit I kind of lost it a little. I started full-on screaming at him. I said some nasty things, and in hindsight, that probably wasn't the brightest decision. I can't remember exactly what, but something I must have said hit a nerve because he stopped swinging the axe abruptly. He actually set it down on the ground before taking a few steps closer to the edge. I could see his face more clearly after that, and it was not a pleasant sight. His eyes were sunken and dark almost, like the skin around them was dark too, if that makes any sense. He leaned over the edge and told me something that I'll never forget. "I know these woods a lot better than you do." Something about the way he said it scared me. Not threatening exactly, but certain, like he was stating a fact I'd be stupid to argue with. We stared at each other for what felt like forever. Then he picked up the axe, turned around, and walked back into the trees. I didn't say anything after him. What was there to say? I stood there trying to process what had happened. The tree was still wedged in place, but I could tell it wasn't stable anymore. The edge on his side was splintered and cracked. I wanted to cross back to the other side right then and there, but there was no way I was entrusting my weight to that tree now. I pulled out my phone, but it had zero service. I decided to cut the hike short. I was mad for sure, but I was also genuinely spooked. I think anyone else in my position would have been too. Something about that encounter felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. I started walking downstream, figuring I'd find another crossing and it would take me back in the direction I'd come from anyway. But I was dead wrong. I walked for what must have been an hour, and the gorge only got deeper. I was pretty sure the gap was widening too. I kept thinking I'd find a spot where I could cross, but every turn just revealed more impossible terrain. To make matters worse, the sun was starting to drop. I was beginning to panic. It was getting dark, and I was miles from my car in the opposite direction I needed to go. I started seriously considering whether I'd have to climb down into the gorge and back out, as insane as that seemed. Just then, I stumbled on what looked like a campsite. It was sitting in this little clearing with a fire pit that looked recently used. At first, I was relieved that maybe there was a fellow camper or hiker that could help me, but the more I looked around, the more wrong it felt. I realized that there were these carvings on the surrounding trees, not like initials or anything recognizable, just these deep gouges and symbols. There were also a bunch of weird objects scattered around, like rusted tools and pieces of cloth tied to branches, what looked like animal bones arranged in patterns. It was freaky. As soon as I saw that stuff, I basically hightailed it out of there. I was about twice as scared as I had been 2 minutes ago, which was saying something. And then, as if it couldn't get any worse, I started hearing sounds behind me, stalking me. Footsteps, or something like footsteps. Every time I spun around, though, everything went silent. I started thinking some kind of predator was trailing me. I picked up my pace, hoping whatever was behind me would lose interest. But no. If anything, the sounds only got louder and honestly a little closer. What happened next is still the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced. As soon as I heard the next sound, I looked over my shoulder for like the 20th time and caught a glimpse of someone ducking behind a tree. A person. I froze and scanned the trees, and I realized there wasn't just one. There was another figure further to the left. They'd fanned out. I was being herded. I don't know what made me realize they'd given up on hiding, but suddenly I could hear them moving more openly. I saw what looked like a pipe or a club in one of their hands, and that was it. I just started running, knowing I couldn't play dumb for much longer. And the exact thing I was dreading happened. They started chasing after me, clearly not concerned with being stealthy anymore. I can't explain how scary it was. I didn't even know what they wanted. I was in the middle of the woods, lost, and the sun had almost set. I felt like I was in a life or death situation, which is probably how I was able to run so fast for so long. I ran faster than I knew I could, and definitely faster than I'd ever run before. One of the people behind me started screaming. Not words, just screams, like war cry type screams. The stuff of nightmares, and I mean that. I kept running. The gorge was still on my left, and just when I felt myself slowing down out of exhaustion, I saw another fallen tree. It was much smaller than the first one had been, but I didn't have a choice. Without thinking, I mounted it and started making my way across. I didn't even have time to see if it was sturdy. Thinking about it now, I was betting my entire life on a tree. It was so tense and I was so tired that I honestly thought I was going to slip and fall. It held up and I made it across. As soon as I made it, I turned around. There were actually 3 figures following me, and they all looked like carbon copies of that first guy who had stranded me. They were filthy, and one of them was in fact holding a pipe. I watched as the first one put his hand on the tree like he was going to cross, then he stepped back down. The 3 of them looked at me menacingly, and for some reason, I found myself unable to move again. Then one of them told me to get the f*** out of there, and that I had gotten lucky, and that was all I needed to hear. I turned and did exactly what they told me to. I kept expecting to hear them behind me, but the forest had gone eerily quiet. The darkness didn't help either, and there were a couple times when I had to fight a full-on breakdown. I must have run at an angle that eventually brought me back toward the trailhead, or maybe I just got impossibly lucky, but I did eventually find it. I reported what I could after driving back home, but I knew there was nothing anyone could or would do. It's been months now. I still hike, but it's honestly not as enjoyable anymore. I really hope I start enjoying it again, because hiking used to be my absolute favorite thing to do, and now I can't even enjoy it without thinking about that experience. It was just so freaky. That first guy with the axe especially. The way he looked at me when he said those things, as if he knew exactly what was going to happen to me. He probably did. Hell, he had probably orchestrated it all. It terrifies me to think that I might have lost my life that day in the woods. This happened 3 years ago. I know a lot of people drag things out, but I don't see the need to do that, so I'm just going to say exactly what happened as it happened. I was hiking through a remote section of forest in northern Minnesota, way off any marked trails. I've always preferred it that way. The actual wilderness, not the sanitized version you get on popular trails with their wooden markers and worn paths. Just me and the woods, the way they're supposed to be. I'd been out there for maybe 4 hours when I noticed I'd lost my bearings. It happens sometimes when you're not following a trail, but usually I can orient myself pretty quickly. This time was different. Nothing looked familiar. The sun was still high enough that I wasn't in immediate danger, but that sick feeling of being lost was already settling into my stomach. I tried to stay calm and kept walking, telling myself I'd spot something recognizable soon. But instead, I started picking up on this rustling sound behind me, the last thing you'd want to hear if you're in my position. The rustling wasn't constant, just every 30 seconds or so, like something was matching my pace. I'd stop, and it would stop too. I'd start walking, and there it was again. I kept telling myself it was probably a deer, but I'd hiked enough times to know that deer don't follow people like that. I kept going, but at that point, I was pretty sure I was being stalked by something. And then, all at once, the rustling turned into movement all around me. It was a worst-case scenario. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. I was surrounded on all sides by a pack of wolves. 6 or 7 of them, if I had to guess. Some of them were snarling at me, and some of them were just staring. But it was clear to me that, to them, I was a meal. I wasn't going to go down without a fight, though. I had my knife out, even though I knew the odds were stacked against me. I remember thinking, this is it. This is actually how I'm gonna die. Alone in the woods because I was too stubborn to stick to the marked trails. I was trying to decide if I should make myself big or stay still or what, when every single wolf suddenly went rigid. All at once, too. Not like they were reacting to each other, but rather all reacting to something else. Their ears shot up, and they all looked in the same direction, somewhere over my shoulder. And then they just scattered. Scattered as in full-on sprint in the opposite direction from where they'd been looking, almost like they were the ones being hunted. That's when the fear started setting in for real. Until that point, it had just been a wicked adrenaline rush, which makes sense given the life and death scenario I thought I was in. But once I was alone again, I started getting the creeps. The first thing I noticed after the wolves scampered away was that the woods were completely silent. No wind, no birds, no critters, nothing. It was like someone had flipped a switch in there. It was still light out, but things felt a little dimmer, sort of how your vision fades when you're lightheaded or right before you're about to pass out. But the worst part by far was why the wolves had run off in the first place. I mean, they had been scared of something, that much was obvious. But whatever could have scared off an entire pack of wolves from a long distance away, I couldn't imagine. I needed to keep moving, but I felt really unsettled, even in the daylight. I kind of wanted to follow the wolves, but I was pretty certain I had been walking in the right direction to begin with. So I was at a crossroads. Follow the wolves just to potentially get encircled again and get even more lost, or continue in the right direction and possibly encounter whatever it was that had scared them off. An impossible choice. I ultimately decided to keep walking in the direction I thought would take me out of the woods, which meant walking toward whatever it was that the wolves had been freaked out by. My logic was I could waste an hour walking the way the wolves had come from, only to turn around anyway and have to walk back in the dark, or just bite my tongue and walk that way while I still had daylight. So that's what I did. Maybe 20 minutes later, I saw what looked like a clearing up ahead. For a second, I thought it might have been a campsite. I could see what looked like a fire ring, but as I got closer, I realized it was wrong. All wrong. There were symbols carved into the trees surrounding the clearing, not initials or trail markers. These were intentional, deep cuts forming patterns I didn't recognize. It gets worse, though. Things were hanging from the branches on what looked like leather cords. Some looked like bones. Small ones, maybe from birds or rodents. Others were metal, rusted, and twisted into shapes that hurt to look at. The fire pit in the center wasn't just a ring of stones. The stones were delicately stacked on top of one another, like structures. There was weird stuff in the fire pit, too. Pieces of cloth, what looked like jewelry, and other objects I couldn't really identify. But here's what made me really freak out. The smoke. There was this thick, black smoke that was just hanging in the air about 6 feet from the ground. It wasn't moving or dissipating, and it didn't look like it was coming from the fire pit either. It was just there. I really wish I could say it was just leftover smoke from the fire pit. The fire pit didn't even look like it had been used recently. I stood at the edge of that clearing. I was frozen to the spot. For some reason, I just couldn't look away from that smoke. My eyes kept tracking back to it, even when I tried focusing on something else. I really have trouble describing the feeling, but it felt like I was looking through a window at something instead of just being there. Like, it felt like I was standing at my kitchen window, looking out into the backyard instead of actually being in the backyard. I don't really know what that means, but that's what it felt like. There was this feeling building in my chest, like grief and terror mixed together, but for some reason that hadn't happened yet. It was almost like my body was mourning something in advance. I've never felt anything like it before or since. I must have stood there for 5 minutes, just staring at that smoke, before something in my brain finally kicked back online. And no, the smoke didn't dissipate in that time. It just stayed there. I finally worked up the strength to turn around and run. I didn't walk or jog, I literally ran. I was overwhelmed with fear. I didn't know what I was running from, but there was this feeling in my gut that told me I needed to get out of the woods. My memory kind of gets foggy after that. I think it's because of how scared I was. So scared that my instincts took over, but part of me thinks the reason my memory faded was somehow connected to whatever the hell was in the woods. The smoke, or the thing that caused the smoke, or something else entirely. I don't know. The next thing I remember is it being dark out, meaning I must have been in those woods for another good hour or so. I was drenched in sweat and, strangely, freezing cold at that point, but I was nearly out of the woods. I was approaching my car. I got in and drove off without another thought, and that was that. I never reported what I found. What would I even say? I couldn't find that clearing again if I tried, and that's even if I remembered things clearly, which I didn't. This will forever be one of those experiences that just doesn't have an explanation. When I told my dad about what happened, he just said that everyone has that one experience sooner or later. Well, this is mine, and the thing that I still think about from time to time is not how those wolves behaved, how that campsite looked, or even that impossible smoke that just hung in the air. It's the memory loss. From all the research I've done, scary moments get remembered better, not worse. So I have no choice but to think that everything that happened that day was connected. Back when I was younger, me and my friends loved to go camping. Once we got our licenses at 16, we were out almost every weekend camping in new spots. Our parents didn't really care as long as we were able to protect ourselves. For this reason, my dad let us borrow one of his guns. It was a Taurus G2C. This happened when we were 18 and seniors in high school. In February, me and my girl Megan, my friend Colin and his girlfriend Anne were gonna drive to Arkansas and backpack the Ozarks to look at some natural waterfalls. It was a 9-hour drive from where we lived, so we left early and made it there around 7 p.m. We set up camp at one of the setup sites for the night since it was late and we were tired. My girl and I were sharing a tent, and Colin and his girl were sharing another. I had the gun in my tent. Nothing happened on the first night. The next morning, we woke up and made breakfast and drove to the start of the trail. We were gonna hike to a waterfall and then go find a place to set up camp. On the hike to the waterfall, Anne kept saying she saw someone standing still and staring at her, but he had been following and she hadn't seen him move. So we stopped to look, and we saw a man quickly run away. Colin yelled at him to fuck off or we'll kick his ass, mostly probably for show to impress his girl. We were capable of defending ourselves though if needed. We continued the hike and didn't see him again. We eventually made it to the waterfall, and there we had lunch and took pictures. After about 2 hours, we decided to go find a place to camp before it got dark. While we were looking for a place to set up camp, I noticed a freakishly tall, skinny woman staring at us. She had to be at least 6'5". It genuinely freaked me out. I pointed her out, and everyone else got unsettled too. We yelled at her to leave us alone and told her we had a gun. She turned around and walked away. We decided to hike further since we were all creeped out. We had no idea if the two weirdos were connected somehow. After another hour, we found a nice spot next to a small flowing creek with a relatively deep pool of water. So we decided to get in the water and relax. While we were splashing around, we talked about the earlier incidents and joked that they were probably hillbillies on drugs. When the sun started to set, we decided to get out and make dinner. We brought chicken breast to grill, rice and vegetables to boil, and some potatoes. We always ate well on our campouts. While I was cooking, Colin set up his tent and helped me with mine. I finished cooking, and we ate before cracking open some of the alcohol we brought. I was, and still am, a pretty heavy smoker, so I brought some weed and papers to roll up. We wanted to have a good time since we put a lot of money into this trip. We told stories and laughed in our intoxicated state. It got to a point where Colin fell out of his chair and just laid on the ground laughing. We did this late into the night and eventually went to our tents. Megan and I were messing around in our tent when we suddenly heard someone laughing outside. At first, I thought it was Colin laughing at us for some reason, so I yelled, "What's so funny?" Colin yelled back, "That wasn't me." That sank my soul and immediately sobered me up. I grabbed the gun, rushed out of the tent, and fired a few shots into the air, yelling for whoever it was to leave us alone or I'd shoot them. That seemed to do the trick because I heard footsteps running away. We moved our tents closer together and decided to have one person stay up at a time as lookout. The next day, we debated going home early, but ultimately decided against it. We were sure we'd scared off whoever it was, so we planned to hike somewhere closer to the exit and camp for one final night. After breakfast, we packed up camp and started the hike back. During the hike, we ran into some other hikers and told them what had happened. They were freaked out too. We chatted for a bit, then continued on. When we stopped for lunch, I realized those were the only other people we'd seen so far, despite there being a ton of cars in the parking lot earlier. After lunch, we continued down the trail, and after about 6 miles, we decided to set up camp. We were around 3 miles from the nearest exit. We pitched our tents and cooked steak and potatoes for dinner. We ate, drank, and smoked again before heading to the tents. In the middle of the night, I woke up needing to pee, so I stepped out of the tent. Out of paranoia, I made sure to bring the gun. While I was peeing, I heard leaves crunching nearby. My heart immediately stopped. I grabbed the gun, finished up, pulled up my pants, and turned on my headlamp. The beam revealed the man from the day before, standing in the distance, holding a machete. I could see him clearly this time. Long, dirty black hair, and super lanky. I screamed and raised the gun as he started charging at me. I fired off every shot I had and must have hit him somewhere, because I heard him yell and saw him fall. By now, Colin, Megan, and Anne were all awake. I told them to pack up. We needed to leave fast. I didn't want to involve the police since I wasn't sure if I could get charged for something, and honestly, his life didn't seem worth it. We didn't bother packing the tents since there wasn't time. We grabbed our bags and practically ran the final 3 miles, making it back to the cars in under an hour. We climbed in, locked the doors, and decided to sleep in the car for the night. We covered the windows and tried to get some rest. When we woke up in the morning, we left immediately and stopped for breakfast at a diner in a small town. We never called the cops, and I'm still conflicted about whether we should have. This happened years ago, and no reports about it ever came out, so for all I know, those psychopaths are still out there.